Hey everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Daydream Nation, and today I've got my mate John the Music Nut. How are you, John?
I'm doing great, Peter. How about you?
Fantastic, fantastic. Today we're going to do a show and we're going to talk about the second album. First album, a hit or sold really well or sold reasonable number of units. Second album, bombed, didn't do as well, but doesn't suck. And we're going to cover about 4 or 5 of our personal picks in this sort of category. So hit me with your first choice, John.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here. This is my favorite out of the 5. And what I'm going to do for you all out there in TV land is I'm going to show you their first album. The band is Living Color. And this album is called Livid. Oh, I'm sorry, Vivid. Livid. I'm livid. I said that wrong. It's Vivid. So Vivid was a huge hit. Vivid had the big hit Cult of Personality, which has become their signature song. They also had another big hit in the States called Glamour Boys. They had a third single that hit the top 100 called Open Letter to a Landlord, which is my favorite song by this band. I love this band. Their first 3 albums, I think, are excellent. I thought this band was going to take over the world. So that was Vivid. Their second album was this one called Time's Up. Now, Time's Up did win the Grammy for Best Hard Rock Performance the following year in 1991. Just like Vivid won a Grammy for Best Hard Rock Performance. This album didn't have any hits on it. It's much more eclectic and, in my opinion, a better album than Vivid, because Vivid, some of the songs are kind of on the poppy side. It seems like there's a bit of record company influence in there. It mixed the eclecticism. Here, it's like they just let them do their thing. And they made this album that I've talked to some people online and they say, well, Time's Up is good, but it's a mess. But to me, it's a wonderful mess. There are, on this album, they could do no wrong in my eyes. They went from hardcore on the title track to menacing yet melodic on Pride and New Jack's Theme and Someone Like You. Elvis Is Dead is rage rock meets James Brown. Type was the first single and video that bombed out. Interestingly enough, Love Rears Its Ugly Head, which is this quasi-blues song where Corey Glover, wonderful vocalist, he sings the heck out of it. This was Love Rears Its Ugly Head, their biggest hit in the UK, their biggest hit in Australia. Did not chart in the United States.
Surprising.
Yes, it did not
Because
chart.
that got a lot of radio airplay in Australia. And that was flogged, that song. Interesting.
Yes, it is, yes. And I mean, you got some video play on these. But and then the second side is even more eclectic and just as topical, if not more so. Undercover of Darkness, a song about safe sex. It's very funky. And then Queen Latifah comes in with her rap. I'm not a big fan of special guests on albums, but special guest on here between Queen Latifah on this track and Little Richard on Elvis Is Dead worked spectacularly. Solace of You is this wonderful ballad that also was a single, but I mean, it wasn't like a power ballad. It was like a different kind of ballad, but again, wonderful song. And this is The Life is this killer psychedelic metal that is excellent. Vernon Reid's lead guitar is excellent on here, especially on Information Overload. Buzz Skillings and William Calhoun, fantastic rhythm section. But yeah, Time's Up, Living Color.
No, that's a good choice. Good choice.
Thank you.
I think as we go through these different choices, is it a case that a band has changed their direction that it hasn't sold, or is it a case that the lead single of the second album hasn't given that oomph that penetrated into the radio audience for them to compel? Oh, we've got to buy their second album. What do you think it's in this case?
well, it's going to be a little bit of both in my list, because when I discovered them with that first video for Cults of Personality in '88, that was the single that got me into them. Like, I got to pick this up. This I got just as quickly, but it was a more of a grower to me. Type wasn't going to be a hit. You listen to this album, you don't hear a song with a hook like Cults of Personality. There are great songs, which I expressed, but yes, to me, it was the singles that really sold Vivid.
Yeah.
Even though I think Time's Up is the better album, and Vivid is great. It's just that Time's Up's a little better, in my opinion.
Well, that's a good example with an album that, didn't do so well, but doesn't suck. I love Living Colour, but that first album was with Vernon Reid, smoking guitar, was just had such a strong character. Absolutely. And maybe because, the lead, the single that got released didn't resonate with the audience because they wanted more of that sort of riffy Vernon Reid type of guitar play. Anyway, that's a good first choice.
One more thing.
Go on.
Thank you, Peter. It just came to my head now. I think another thing that helped this album sell as well as it did is they opened for the Rolling Stones on the Steel Wheels tour in '89 because they were friends with Mick Jagger, and Mick Jagger actually, I think he does a background vocal on Vivid. So he really loved this band to bring them out and get them that exposure. The Rolling Stones' first tour in 8 years. That, I think, helped the album out tremendously as well.
Well, that couldn't have hurt in any shape or form. But anyway, all right, that's a good first choice. My first choice is a band from Australia. They were sort of around the era of garage rock in the early 2000s. So you had bands like The Vines, White Stripes, The Hives, etc., etc. And this band came out in 2003, and it was Get Born. That was a bit of a hit. So it hit to number 26 in the US charts, went platinum, 1,700,000 copies. So is that like platinum plus gold? I don't know what they do the certification. UK, it went platinum, 300K, and it was off the back of that hit, Are You Gonna Be My Girl? Sure, it cribs a bit of Iggy Pop, Lust for Life. It was retro. They had another hit over here called Rollover DJ. But it was, the album was an uber hit, and they were really flying the flag for rock. So you go to 3 years later, they put an album out called Shine On. UK hits number 13, US hits number 16, Australia hits number 3, but it disappeared. It sort of hit one of those albums where it hits the high reaches of the charts, and then second, third week, it just disappears. And I don't think it even sort of attained gold status in any of those regions. I think it's a great album, and I think it's a better album than their first because their songcraft has matured. It's kind of dark, introspective. I know that the brothers that comprise the main songwriters of the band are the brothers Chris and Nick Sester. Their father died, and a lot of their passion and sensitivity to the loss of their father came out in, for example, one of the lead songs, Shine On. I mean, they've still got that Beatles influence that you still hear a little bit of Oasis and the Stones and Wings and that classic 70s rock. But there's a few ballads on the album, but it shows a much more sensitive side to them. But they can still put out the rockers like Rip It Up, which is like a power riff, Stand Up, which is like a hard rocker, and Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is. I think it's a really, really strong album, and I actually prefer it to Get Born because, bar the lead singles, there is a little bit of filler on it, and I think this is a much more mature album, but it didn't sell. So why didn't it sell? Maybe because there were too many ballads, it's too dark, too introspective, and it doesn't have that lead, catchy, hooky single. And also it came out 3 years after the original album. That's timing of a second album is very critical, because if you leave it too long, the wave is gone. So that's my example. Shine On. I mean, the first album, I wouldn't say it was a multi-platinum hit, but it's certainly, in the rock circles in America and the UK, you knew who Jep was, because that song, Are You Gonna Be My Girl, was everywhere. It was even on Levi commercials. It was just flogged everywhere. But, the second album, it died, but it's probably a better album because it's got better songcraft. Anyway, that's my choice.
Excellent. Great choice. Well, let's go. My second one here. All right. We're going to talk about hip hop right now.
I know. I bet you I know which one this is.
Yes, sir. I know you know. Well, and you'll really know when I tell you my personal story. I had the first album. It sold several million copies.
I definitely know who this is.
I didn't care for it. I had it on cassette. I gave it to my cousin who was visiting from near Binghamton, New York. And I said, you can have this. I don't like this. This was before the second album came out. When the second album came out, I had no interest in buying it, but I had a friend who would play it every day at work. I was washing dishes back then. And this album sold, to this day, has sold a fraction of what that first album sold. And yes, it's the Beastie Boys.
Yes, absolutely. I knew that would be. I actually thought about that one.
This is Paul's Boutique. And their first album was Licensed to Ill. I don't have a copy to show you because I didn't buy the CD. I still don't like that album. It's one of those albums I can never see myself revisiting. I still listen to Paul's Boutique pretty frequently. I think this album is aged so well. It's considered one of the best hip hop albums of all time, and it should be. It was the album that introduced me to David Bromberg, whose music I got into much later when I had good friends down at the pub who loved folk music, who got me into David Bromberg. And I heard that song Sharon. I'm like, oh, Johnny Royale. That's where they took the sample from David Bromberg's Sharon. Idris Muhammad. They took the sample from his song on Power of Soul to Fort track, which escapes me right now. I think it's Luron's Dance. They used that for the first song, To All the Girls. And there's so many great songs on there. Hey Ladies was the single. Now, unlike Fight for Your Right to Party, which hit number 7 in the United States, it stalled out number 36 here in the States. And, maybe Johnny Royale or Shake Your Rump may have been better singles, better choices as singles. But when you listen to this album, you don't hear this automatic hit single like you did on Licensed to Ill. Like even No Sleep Till Brooklyn sounds more like a hit single than anything on here. But what you have here is something that's a lot more eclectic. It's a lot more dense. It's a lot more mature. I'm not saying they're still saying some sophomore lyrics, but there's the lyrics on here they'll stick with you. There's the samples on here. This was before. I mean, they did get a lot of the samples cleared, but this was before the lawsuit that tried to stop a lot of that from happening. So many great songs on here. Looking Down the Barrel of a Gun, Shadrach, High Plains Drifter, B-Boy Bouillabaisse is kind of like their Abbey Road medley at the end of the album. This album is great. In fact, I think this was the first of 3 classic albums by the Beastie Boys. I love this. I love Check Your Head. I love Ill Communication. By Check Your Head, they were playing their own instruments too. So now you had this rap meets sloppy punk meets Santana sound to them that I really love, because I love Santana and I like a lot of punk music. But anyway, Paul's Boutique has been remastered, and they put out double disc versions and 20th anniversary versions. I don't believe they did that with Licensed to Ill. Licensed to Ill is an album of its time. This is an album that still sounds fresh today, and it's my second choice. Beastie Boys, Paul's Boutique.
Well, thank you, mate, for putting that up, because that was definitely in my sights. But I had I don't know, maybe the sixth sense that you were going to pick that, so I defer to you. And yeah, that's a nice little commentary. I just had this in my head. I bet you John the Music Nut picks that one. So
I think Peter's going to pick. Peter has one that I'm thinking about too.
Yeah, but influential as hell.
Yes.
This is where they sort of really tap into rock and funk, and their musical palette is definitely much broader than their first album. I like the first album. It's very much of its time. Yeah, it's a little bit frat boy, and it probably has influenced a lot of bands that I loathe, a lot of genres of music I loathe, but I like it. It was very much, and it was tongue firmly planted in their cheek. So, yeah, I like it. But this album is, is just heads and shoulders in a different sort of musical world. And that's why it bombed. Because all the jocks and the frat boys and the people and even the metalheads that liked that first album, they came to the second album and go, what the hell's this? They weren't prepared for it. And sometimes, there are so many albums in history that bomb, but people go back and see, wow, what an album. This actually started and created a whole genre of music. This whole collage of hip hop was brought to this, a different level because of that album. So it's just so influential, and yeah, that's a really, really good choice. It's still, I think when they do the Rolling Stone 100 greatest albums of all time, it's the number one Beastie Boys album, and it's right up in any of the hip hop albums when they do those polls. So
yes, it is. Absolutely.
All right, my next one is a real case study on first album. It was just a huge hit, and the second album, it went bong bong. But that was more so with the sales and the audience. From an artistic point of view, I disagree. So the first album had one song that propelled it, and it's got a riff that is just, everyone knows the riff, and I'm talking about the Knack. Get the Knack?
Oh, yeah.
My Sharona. So, My Sharona went to number one all around the world, US, Australia. Get the Knack went to number one in the US, also Australia. 2 million platinum. But this album, But the Little Girls Understand, only hit number 16 or number 15 in Australia 32. It did go gold, and then it just sort of dropped off. This was released maybe 16 months after Get the Knack. I think it's a fine album. I think it was a case that there was a big backlash and the bubble had exploded.
Yes.
And it didn't matter what good quality songwriting that was on this album. It's sort of the public didn't seem to accept it. The lead single was Baby Talks Dirty, which to me has always sounded like a sequel to My Sharona. Some really good songs. Can't Put a Price on Love, Have a Rave Up, Mr. Handleman. It's got all the elements of what I love about the Knack. Power pop. To my ears, it's even more hard hitting. It's more aggressive. It's got fine production of Mike Chapman, who had his fingertips on all of those wonderful UK glam bands of the 70s, and Blondie. And that first album, Get the Knack, that was recorded for $18,000. $18,000 2 weeks. So I think there was a little bit more money that was thrown at this album, but it bombed. And in Grant, Arthur, and my interview with Prescott Niles, there were a lot of reasons why it did bomb. The wrong single that was put out, the backlash, etc., etc. But I've always been a defender of this album. I think it's sort of, maybe it's not as good as the original, the first album, Get the Knack, but it's still a mighty fine album. If you like that retro 60s Kinks style, fast, aggressive power pop, and I love it. And it should have been a much bigger hit. But, this is an interesting case study where there are some bands, John, that can be number one in the world for just a short period of time. It's like lightning in a bottle, and then it disappears. And you can't get that ever again.
Yes, that was a wonderful interview that you and Grant both did.
Thank you. He was just a wonderful person to interview, and he could have talked for hours. Yeah, check it out. Check it out on the channel. It's there on both my channel and Grant's, the same interview. He had so many great stories in regards to that. But even while I was interviewing him, I kept on asserting my view that this album is being unfairly maligned and it should be revisited. So if you like Get the Knack, revisit this album. It doesn't suck, but it bombed.
And I have to pick that album up because I have Get the Knack and I love Get the Knack.
Yeah.
Of course, I bought it many, many years later, of course, but Get the Knack is their classic power pop album. It's just not that one single. There's so many wonderful songs on that album. And I have to pick up I have to pick up What the Little Girls Understand. I mean, if it's more of the same, okay, maybe it's not going to be tippy top, but if it's still top, you got to give it a shot. And I agree on the first single. Yeah, Baby Talks Dirty. I mean, it's not quite as strong as the first two singles.
It kind of has a bit of a sequel to My Sharona, even though Prescott Knowles disagreed with me. But yeah, I sort of see a bit of a lineage, but it's a case, maybe they didn't get the right single. If they got the right single, would have given them a bit of oomph.
Definitely.
All righty. What do you got for your third?
Okay, my third one, let me just reach over here because I don't have the original, but in the 90s, I got into a band called Steely Dan. And this is their box set, Citizen Steely Dan, that has their first 7 albums from 1972 to 1980. I never replaced it because I had the first 7 albums here. And that was good. That was good enough for me. I love Steely Dan to this day. But the album I'm going to talk about, I mean, they put the 7 discs on 4 discs of the box set. So here's the first 2 discs of the box set. The album I'm going to discuss is Countdown to Ecstasy. Now, the first album was Can't Buy a Thrill. Can't Buy a Thrill had huge hits. Do It Again, Real in the Years. They hit number 6 and 11 in the United States, respectively. Dirty Work was also a very popular song. I also remember it being played in a scene on The Sopranos, but it was a very well-known song. The album it's a good album, but they kind of play it straight on there. It's more of a sophisticated pop album to me. It's an album I like very much. But the second album, Countdown to Ecstasy, was where they found their sound. They brought in that jazz element. They brought in a harder element. It was harder. The songs they still had the hooks, but they were more eclectic. They were better musically. To me, that is where the Countdown to Ecstasy is where the true Steely Dan emerged. No hit singles. I believe Showbiz Kids was a single, but it hit the top 100, but didn't hit the top 40. But songs like My Old School and Boston Rag and King of the World are just fantastic songs. Bodhisattva was the first track that let off the album. That is more of a rock feel. That song got that, and along with My Old School, you still hear it occasionally on classic rock stations. Used to hear it a lot more. But this album only went gold compared to platinum for Can't Buy a Thrill. In fact, of the first 7 albums by Steely Dan, the only album that didn't go platinum in the States was Countdown to Ecstasy. And to me, it was the first of several classic albums by Steely Dan. And that's my third choice. Steely Dan, Countdown to Ecstasy, 1973, I believe.
Okay. Do you think it didn't go platinum or sell more because of the jazzy element? It went too far in that direction?
I think it
where
was part of
people were expecting Reeling in the Years and that sort of sound.
Yes, I think they were expecting more of that. I mean, they were excellent musicians, but their songs were, for lack of a better term, simple compared to what came later. It's like with Frank Zappa,
Yep.
with Overnight Sensation, Apostrophe. If they're simple as far as his catalog, but they're not simple songs. And they're more accessible. Same thing, I believe, with that album, with Can't Buy a Thrill and the singles that were on there, than what came after that. I think I think the radio programmers and all that's like, oh, we don't hear a hit here.
Yeah.
So perhaps they didn't put the money and the marketing behind it. But I mean, to me, it's just a better album, and I think it deserved a better fate. I mean, it went gold. I mean, and perhaps, but anybody who's a big Steely Dan fan knows it's great. But it just didn't have the hits.
Absolutely. No, that's a good one. That's a good choice. I've got a question. So if an artist doesn't have a blockbuster debut record, their second or third is a slow build-up. Does that mean they have a longer career? Because when you look at the big bands, it's an interesting case study to see those bands that had a huge debut and where they are now in respect to their discography. Was it a slow build-up? What's your theory? Do you think that, bands that usually have a longer career have, they come out of the bolt with a great big selling debut, or it's sort of like the second and third, it's sort of a build-up?
Well, in the 70s, I think what happened, you had a little bit of both, because back then, record companies would work with the bands. They would give you a few albums to find your sound. It's the music business, but back then they still believed more into the artist. They'd give the band a few albums to find their sound and to grow. You look at Rush. They found the sound on album 2, but it was album 4 that broke them. And then they got bigger as time went on. You look at Judas Priest. It took them a few albums. Sad Wings of Destiny was the second album. They still had some a little bit of prog elements. And by Stained Class, the 4th album, they really had their sound down. But the record companies work with them. And people like me found them later on a later album like British Steel, and we went back to the older album, and then those bands became favorites for us for the rest of our lives. I think it's when you build a catalog and you have that slow burn, I think it makes a career. Look at Aerosmith. Aerosmith's first album bombed. Dream On was a single on that first album, but it didn't become a hit until after their third album, Toys in the Attic, became a hit. And then people went back, this song, let's listen to Get Your Wings. Let's listen to the debut. I think it depends on when you came up. It depends when you came up. Like we go to the 80s. Say Rat didn't hit big without a song. Would they? I mean, I'm not saying they're superstar band, but they did have a few good albums and a few popular singles. But if that didn't hit, I don't know, would they have ever had a hit? Like, would the record company have still believed in them?
I doubt that, because I think if it got to the point of their second album, there would have been I think in that environment, there were a lot of bands that sounded like them and were in that sort of genre. And they would have found it very competitive, because when they put out the Cellar, they were sort of like the leaders of the pack at that particular time. And it goes back to what I said earlier, like it lightning in a bottle, because that album sold 3 million. The second album, 2 million, and then it went 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. But by
Right.
that time, a lot of the hair bands or hard rock bands had caught up and, took their sound, got more commercial success. I think the answer to my question is a bit of both.
Right.
But one thing for sure, in the 70s, the record companies were definitely supporting their artists and letting them breathe and grow and, sort of develop. But in today, or I think from the 90s and the 2000s onwards, where the bean counters were ruling the record companies, if you didn't succeed with the one or two albums, you're gone.
Yeah, and just on that note, look at a show like American Idol, where they try to make a star. Someone wins the series. They put them out. They put a lot of money behind that first album, and if it doesn't sell, that's it.
They're gone.
And then they're playing small theaters. I've seen it. I've seen these singers win American Idol, and you had some that became really big successes like Carrie Underwood, but you also had a lot of them who they were putting them out on this big tour and they're playing arenas, and 2-3 years later they're playing small theaters because they lost a record company contract.
Well, that's a whole different topic, my friend. And it's contrived to the max. I'm not a big supporter. I believe in probably like you, grassroots and getting in the pubs and the bars and working your way up and developing your songcraft. Because to me, it's like lotto, a lottery. Okay, you win. Yeah. It's like, I go to my news agents and I fill out the lotto card and I win $1 million. Yeah. It's short. But does it make a career?
And Pink Floyd and Fleetwood Mac, two more bands that they built their sound. They went through different. Yeah. Fleetwood Mac went through different lineup members, different changes in their sound. But by the time they hit with that self-titled album, how many albums did they have in the bank?
Absolutely. But I think we all agree, and the topic of this show is sophomore albums. Sophomore is very difficult. That is a very difficult watermark for a lot of bands in respect of sales. And I think once a band gets over that sophomore album, then more or less they're on a road to a long and prosperous career. But it always seems to be that the sophomore album is the one that a lot of bands come a cropper, because there's a history of bands that just sort of fold up. All right. My next one is a little bit different for this channel, but just hear me out. There was a band that made a big impact in the UK in the mid-80s, or maybe 1984. It was on the ZTT, the Zum Tum Tum label. It was produced by Trevor Horn, who was famous for this Phil Spector wall of sound, very symphonic, lush instrumentation. Trevor Horn, for those, he was in a band called the Buggles. Previous to that, he was actually on a couple of albums with Yes. He produced ABC, the Lexicon of Love album, and a lot of albums in the 80s, kind of synth pop. And he did some work with a band from Liverpool called Frankie Goes to Hollywood. And they had two huge hits in England. One was Relax. Now, that received a little bit of controversy because the film clip got banned from the BBC, and I think the song got banned from the BBC for the lyrical content. And nothing succeeds like a ban, John the Music Nut, because when you ban something, people buy it.
It gets bigger.
I love the song. It had this thumping bass line. It was heavy. It was a dance track, but it appealed to me in the rock sense because it was driving, it was hard, and it was just a really hooky synth pop song. Even though I sort of, to my ears, because I love new wave, it sort of really appealed to me. They did One Notch Higher with Two Tribes, which was wall of sound. It was like Phil Spector through Trevor Horn. You had the symphony. It was just like a an opera in 4 minutes. There's about 100 different mixes of this song. They put out an album called Welcome to the Pleasure Dome. It's a bit flabby.
I
Oh
love
well.
it, Peter.
Anyway, it's a bit flabby. There's some. They did another song called "The Power of Love," which is a really moving song. So they had 3 number ones in a row in the UK. But Welcome to the Power Dome did really well. It went triple platinum in the UK, gold in the US, but it's a little bit flabby. So this came out in 1984. The band members didn't actually play on this album. It was Trevor Horn, his session players. You had Holly Johnson. He was doing the singing, but he actually, Trevor Horn had his own session players. So that's one of those things where you think, oh, okay, the people you see in the video clip are actually playing on this album. No, it wasn't. But they got the opportunity when, in 1986, they put out this album, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Liverpool. And I picked this up recently. This is actually a Russian copy. It's all... Look at that.
Yeah. Oh, sweet.
Yeah, Russian. And it's
Nice.
it's on a Russian label. I don't know if you can see the Russian writing.
Wow.
And, it's a single album. So the Frankie Goes to Hollywood crew, Brian Nash, Mark O'Toole, and Peter Gill, they get to play. And it's a harder hitting album. It's kind of rock. It still has that synth pop, funk sensibility, dance club, but there's a lot of rock in it. And to my ears, I like it. And I think it's a much more even and mature album than Welcome to the Pleasure Dome, because when you take those 3 fantastic singles, as I said, there's a lot of filler. There's a little bit of flab. For heaven's sake, it's a beautiful Holly vocal. It's very sensitive. There's a lot of the lyrics are kind of deeper. They're more introspective. You feel like this band has actually got control, and it's not the Trevor Horn show. It's actually them and their own personalities. Warriors of the Wasteland, that rage hard, kill the pain. I like it. I like it a lot. It's a much more even, consistent album, and it has all the elements of a new wave electronic rock album, and it's got a lot of atmosphere. It's got a lot of big end. It reached number 5 in the UK charts. It reached number 88 in the US chart. It kind of bombed. There was a tour that they did. Holly was at war and loggerheads with the other members of the band. And there was some conjecture that Holly was going to get fired, and they were trying to bring in a new lead singer. They somehow jagged out the rest of the tour, and they broke up. And that was it for Frankie Goes to Hollywood. So this is a case where a second album, probably in hindsight, it came out a little bit too late. So between 1983 or 1984 and 1986, probably the wave was over for Frankie Goes to Hollywood. If it came out a couple of years earlier, then it may have, done a lot better. But there you have it. That's my pick. And I've always liked those Frankie Go to Hollywood songs of Welcome to the Pleasure Dome. But this album, I don't think gets the kudos that it deserves. And I think it's a really strong second album, which tanked.
Yes, I agree with you completely. It's a more consistent album. Welcome to the Pleasure Dome was a top-heavy album. The first side had almost all the hits. And along with that, interesting but very, I like the version of Edwin Starr's War on there. It's completely different, but I think they did a very good job with it. The version of Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run, it actually is heavier. It's so over the top. But like you said, the second half of the album, outside of Power of Love, which was a number 2 hit in the UK, the rest, it's, there's some filler. Crystal Kisses and You're the Only Star in Heaven, songs like that. But Liverpool's very consistent. I love Kill the Pain. I love Maximum Joy. Holly Johnson sings so well on this song.
Yeah, he's got a great voice, and there's a whole history of bands that weren't allowed to play on their albums, and when they got the opportunity to play on the albums, then the way was over. Monkeys, their strongest albums were the later part of their discography. Mm-hmm. Probably they were past their peak commercially. So, yeah, there you go. So that was one of your choices, was it?
Yes. What you're seeing, everyone, is you're seeing two friends from other sides of the world who shared the same brain on that one. Because, yes, my number 4 was going to be Frankie Goes to Hollywood for the same reasons that Peter just discussed here. It's a more consistent album, but they waited too long. I'm glad I have some backups here, but I mean, Peter,
I didn't expect that would happen.
Yeah.
A bit of a shout out to the production of Stephen Lipson, who's one of Trevor Horn's proteges. He's done a lot of work with Paul McCartney. I think he did the Flowers album, Grace Jones and Simple Minds. But he really sort of does continue that wall of sound approach. But again, this album is much more direct and organic, mm-hmm. and allows the actual players to shine. So it's definitely one. Go back in time, give it a listen. Just go back and listen to this album. I think you'd be surprised.
Absolutely. So this is more of a personal love for me, because this man didn't sell a lot of albums in his lifetime. He's no longer with us. And I've talked about him on Grant's channel. My love for Chris Whitley. This was his debut, Living with the Law. This was the only album that made any tread in the United States. He was getting a push from his record company at the time. He had, I believe, Malcolm Byrne produced this album. He worked with Daniel Lanois. But it's kind of got a roots rock sound to it, but he was getting the push. He was getting songs on Album Rock Radio like Big Sky Country and the song Living with the Law. He opened up for Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers on their tour at that point. They might have been pushing into the Great Wide Open album. But the next album, which is the one that I love, that's a sophomore album that didn't do well, is this one. It's called Den of Ecstasy. Now, this album, instead of making Living with the Law Part 2 it's kind of got this blues rock kind of sound to it, he makes a darker lyrical album. And it's got heavy guitar, a la Hendrix meets grunge. And on here, the emphasis is on his voice, where he sings about a lot of mental illness and things like that. It's a very dark album. Like, he talked about darker themes on Living with the Law, but on this album, the music met themes. It's very well produced again. And when I say very well produced, it's not overproduced. It sounds nearly perfect. There's a great balance between the instruments, but this album, because it didn't sound like Living with the Law, which maybe they thought the next album would take them to the next level, between 4 years in between albums, and him completely changing the sound, because he is an artist before a musician. A great musician, but an artist too, because as his career went on, he went more in the indie label, and he made albums that spanned a variety of genres. But this album, it's great songs like Narcotic Prayer, Oh My Heart Is Breaking, Oh My Heart Is Bleeding, Din, God Thing. Some of it's like raging rock, some of it's very slow and atmospheric and introspective. He does a cover of Some Candy Talkin', which I believe Jesus and Mary Chain was the originators of that song. Songs like WPL, Wild Pagan Love. So many great tracks on here, but it's one that has to be listened to in a piece. And it was one that the critics shit all over, but I loved it from the first time I heard it. I thought it was an excellent album. And it's one that I still love today. So it's Chris Whitley, Den of Ecstasy.
I'm not familiar with him, so I'll definitely investigate. And look, it fits perfectly into the theme of this show. It's where the first album does well or sells okay, but the second album is a drop off, and but doesn't suck.
Yeah, and people. I mean, there are people. He loves the album. Like when he would do live shows later on, do live albums, he still hit that album pretty hard. And then with the third album, the record company said, "Okay, make a combination of both," and it didn't work out as well. And then they dropped him from the label, and then he went on independent label. He actually sold more albums with his first independent label album than he did with his last major label album. Okay. So because they just didn't put the marketing behind it. I mean, and again, he was very eclectic. He was one of the best pedal steel guitar players you'd ever hear in your life. His voice was very distinctive, but he was somebody I wish I saw live, and I never did. But yeah, Chris Whitley, fantastic singer-songwriter.
I'll definitely check that out. No, thanks, John.
You're welcome. You can still find these albums pretty easily. The first two you can still find on Amazon. You can still find them in your local CD shops. And all that.
Oh, I'm always into discovering new music and going down a rabbit hole. So that sounds pretty compelling. I'll definitely check that one out.
Excellent.
All right. Well, my final pick is another band that was in that garage rock genre of the early 2000s. And they hailed from New Zealand. They were named after a Japanese car, and they were called the Datsuns. So I don't know if you're familiar with them, John, but they were pretty big in Europe and UK. Their self-titled, their first album went top 20, and they were looking on the way up. For their second album, the Datsuns, Out of Sight, Out of Mind of 2004, they actually got the producer John Paul Jones that you may have heard from Led Zeppelin, and he did their second album. It bombed. It didn't do so well, but to my ears, it's got all the elements that I love about the Datsuns. It's retro. It's like somebody that loves 70s hard rock or classic rock. It's got a bit of prog. If you like Rainbow, if you love Rush, if you love Deep Purple, if you love Led Zeppelin, you like a little bit of Hammond, this album's for you. Some of it's sped up. It's got a little bit of punk sensibility. I love it. So the Datsuns follow that sort of lineage of the Ramones because all the members of the band have the surname of the Datsuns. So you've got on vocals, Dolph de Datsun. You've got Christian Datsun on guitar and Phil Datsun on guitar and Matt Datsun on drums. So Dolph de Datsun, I just have to clarify, is the vocalist. But they've had about 5 or 6 albums. I've seen them live a few times. I think, they were, I saw them at a festival that was around our parts in the early 2000s, the Big Day Out. And they came on before the Strokes or Metallica in Auckland, and they played a set of 30 minutes, and I thought they were probably the best band I've heard for a long time. They were just on fire. And they do those really sharp, fast, classic rock songs that only last like 3 minutes, but they're really, truly memorable. Some of the songs that I really like on this, Blacken My Thumb, Messing Around, Hong Kong Fury, and Don't Come Knocking. So if you love that sort of sped up garage rock that has a mixture of classic rock from the 70s, a bit of prog, this band's for you. And the production sounds really nice. John Paul Jones, the instrumentation, it's got that warm 70s feel to it. So, look, John, I think you'd really like it. Check it out. So
Absolutely.
that's the Datsuns, Out of Sight and Out of Mind of 2004, but it bombed. And because they had a lot of heat on their first album, I thought that the second album would do more. But I think that whole garage rock scene of the early 2000s, there were so many artists that, their flame burned very brightly on the first album, but it sort of petered out. So it's just one of those things. And, I remember the Rolling Stone magazine where they had the vines on the front cover and it said, "Rock is back." That's another case example. The Vines, first album, huge hit, second album. But just one of the saviors of rock, and it just didn't kick on.
Definitely another one to check out too for me.
Absolutely. So have you got any honorable mentions you want to throw in? I haven't.
Yeah, I'll give you one, but I mean, it's one that a lot of people know about, but I mean, it's always worth mentioning. Favorite band of mine, The Clash. Here's their debut. Considered a classic punk album. So many great songs here, not just punk, they're also reggae. And the second album, and this is Martin Popoff's favorite album by The Clash, is Give 'Em Enough Rope right here. And this isn't quite as good as the debut, but it's very, very good. I mean, you have Safe European Home, Tommy Gunn, Drug Stabbing Time. There's so many great songs on here. Julie's been working for the Drug Squad, Guns on the Roof, Stay Free. It's got more of a hard rock production. I believe Sandy Pearlman produced this.
Yes.
He did some work with Blue Oyster Cult. I know that.
He did.
Yes, but this album it's kind of ignored in the annals of The Clash, but it's quite good. Everything they did was very good. But Give 'Em Enough Rope should get a little more love than it gets. It's very good. There we go. 1979, I believe this was released. And then later on in that year, they would release London Calling, and the rest is history. Classic album, London Calling is. Peter Young.
So I was quickly researching to see, did it do better than the first album or the second? That's why there was a little pause.
Okay. It might have charted higher than the first album, but when you go through the years, I'm going to say it sold significantly less because with people who like The Clash, it's The Clash and London Calling, and Combat Rock's the biggest seller because it had the two big hits. But Give 'Em Enough Rope, I mean, I believe it charted at 128 in the United States, but over the years, it's probably their least selling album.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely better than Cut the Crap. No, I think it's a great album. I love the production on it, and I think the songwriting is just fantastic. My personal favorite, I did a show with Martin Popoff on this channel, was the debut. I thought it was a little bit of a drop off, but not significantly, and I rank it very highly. But the songwriting is stellar. The playing is aggressive and it's very direct. And yes, they did have that production, that probably the better production because of, much more. I think they were sort of getting used to what it was like in a recording studio, what it actually entailed. Because when they were first putting down the debut, they were learning as they were going along. They didn't know the mechanisms of working in a studio. It was sort of like, let's put on a show and let's see how we go as we're going along. But this second one, they had a very astute producer. There was a lot of creative sort of angst and resentment because they sort of regarded the producer as a bit of, he worked with Blue Oyster Cult, it's that sort of punk, that young sort of angst sort of thing. But definitely, I think through all the angst, it put them on the path of what you could do in a studio, and here are the rules, and here's what needs to be done. So, no, that's a good one. But yeah, there you go. Well, thank you very much for this, John. This has been a really good show. It's interesting. As I said, the second album is always the difficult one, the sophomore. And this one is, I think we've really illustrated that there are some second albums that may have not done commercially, did not pick up the listeners' ears at the time, but actually don't suck. They actually are decent. Anyway, thank you very much. Please subscribe and like to Rock Daydream Nation. We've got plenty of content coming up, and John and I will be doing a show probably in a couple of weeks. We'll pick another topic and check us out then. Cheers.
Take care.